Welcome to Gilbert, Arizona. I'm John Kirkwood, and this is Church Without Walls. And today I'm going to talk to you about something that I get asked quite a bit about. And it seems to be the third rail of Christian discussions. And it's centered around human sexuality because I think 21st century Americans are obsessed, I think, with each other's sexual indiscretions. But I'm often asked about homosexuality and its place within the church. And are they welcome? Are they not welcome? They is an interesting way to put it. And in my answer to a friend this week, I said, I don't really think we understand what the early church was like. You know, we read Paul's letters. They're 2,000 years old. And we read those letters and we read them through 21st century lenses, as if, you know, Paul was writing from Manhattan. And that's not the case. I don't think we really appreciate what the first century church was like, because within an audience, let's say the church at Philippi, the early church at Philippi, we know was in a woman's living room. Her name was Lydia. She was a businesswoman. She was very successful. She was one of the first converts in Philippi, which was a trade city. So the first thing we see that was different about the early church than our church is women had a prominent role. We've actually become degressive in the church today. I grew up in Baptist churches that would not allow women to be deacons, serve on any board. They could serve coffee. Yeah, we'll let them serve coffee. We'll let them watch children in the nursery. But other than that, that's it. And not only is that contrary to scripture, it's contrary to tradition. But if you think about it, when Paul sent a letter to a church, the person bearing that letter would be the one who read it in the church and answered any questions, you know, because they most probably had been with Paul either while he was in prison or traveling with him as a companion. And he had explained it to them. And then he sent them to deliver it to the church. On at least two occasions, this was done by a woman, right? We know with the epistle, first epistle to the Corinthians and Romans as well, delivered by women, and probably first exegeted by women in the churches, respectively, in Rome and Corinth. So that would never happen today. You know, you'd have John MacArthur telling women to go home. But what about homosexuals, right? You know, people point to half a dozen verses in the Bible that condemns homosexuality. And so we have this culture war going on, Christians against them or against gays and baking the cakes and all this stuff. And we have evangelical children that are afraid to tell their parents that they're gay. And I don't think, again, we understand in Lydia's living room, there were all kinds of people sitting there because they were welcome to come as they are. Jesus Christ said, "Come to me, all those who are weary, and I will give you rest." He didn't require them to sign a statement of faith, to pray a creed. It was an open invitation. Now, churches now have gotten pretty rigid. If you want to join in membership, you have to agree that you believe everything in their statement of faith, or you won't, you know, and all this stuff. And all this stuff has come to pass really because churches own property now. And people want to fight over money, over budgets, over control of property and so forth. And that wouldn't happen in Lydia's house. And I'm just saying, I think there's something about a home church that is much more welcoming than an institutional church, because we don't have this question. If my neighbors are gay and they want to celebrate Jesus and they know I'm inviting people over to praise Jesus and break bread, they're welcome at my dinner table, and because of my Christian faith, right? And yet, in certain churches, they might not feel welcome. They might not feel welcome. But let me just talk to you a little bit about first century. During the time of Paul, there were slave owners in those early churches. as repugnant as that sounds to us today, there were people who owned slaves that went to, I'll use Lydia as an example. I don't know this for certain, but certainly in Rome, but in the Roman church, certainly in the Corinthian church, there were wealthy people and they owned slaves. And there were also, we know from the early church fathers, we know that there was a great deal of slaves who were in church, who came to church. So we had slaves. Now, I don't know if you understand this about Roman slavery, but if a Roman slave master had 6 slaves and 3 boys and 3 girls, 3 men, 3 female, he had sexual rights over all of them. In other words, he could sleep with them all. And I don't know how frequent it was, but it was a commonplace thing. If you read some of the historians of the early church, if you read some of the early church fathers, one of the things that I think Paul was getting at in Corinthians is sexual purity. Sexual purity is clearly taught in the New Testament, but the ideas were a little bit different then. We're not talking about Ellen DeGeneres and her girlfriend. We're most likely talking about a slave owner and both male and female slaves and so forth. And so there were some different conditions. And to pretend that culture doesn't play a role in how we discern sexuality is frankly crazy. I had a woman say to me once, but the Bible from the very early chapters from Genesis expresses the ideal of one man, one woman under God for one lifetime. I agree with that. That's true. That's, I believe, taught in Genesis as the ideal. And it's reiterated by Jesus when he talks about marriage as the ideal. But that ideal was expressed by a guy who had 2 wives. If you believe that Moses wrote Genesis, that was written, the ideal was written by a guy who had 2 wives. He was an ancient Hebrew Horite. The Hebrew Horite tribal leaders all had 2 wives. So if you look back in history, they had 2 wives. We know Moses was married and had an interracial marriage. How progressive. So Jacob had 2 wives. Now, you really, when you talk about biblical marriage, it's not as clean as you'd like to make it, because there was levirate marriage. There was, and to be honest with you, levirate marriage is more offensive to me than Ellen having a girlfriend or having a wife. Levirate marriage meant if my brother's wife, if my brother died and my sister-in-law hadn't given birth to a male child yet, I'd take her in my bed until she had a male child, and my wife couldn't complain, and it was an honorable thing to do, right? To keep the land and the family name in Israel. That was levirate marriage. You had people marrying at a very young age. You had girls given away in arranged marriages. So please don't Bible thump your idea of sexual purity. Sexual purity exists within the Bible, and yet there were cultural conditions that were in place. Jacob had 2 wives and 2 concubines, and the whole history of Israel is built on those 4 women and their offspring. God, in metaphor, has had multiple wives. If you read the Old Testament, you find out he was married to Israel and Judah at the same time, sisters, not unlike Jacob, who was married to sisters. Divorce was looked on in the time of Jesus much differently than it is today. And so it's very offensive to some people within the church today that a group of Christians who support President Trump, like let's say Franklin Graham and both Dr. Brown have come out in incredible support of President Trump. And I don't want to make this political. I'm not going to get political today, but they're supporting a guy who's been accused of sexual indiscretions, who's openly bragged about adultery in his book and said he's never asked for forgiveness for anything. So you have 2 evangelical leaders defending that guy, but saying to some mayor from Indiana that he's disqualified from being president because he's gay. And people look at this and their heads explode with the hypocrisy that apparently somehow is missing from these evangelical leaders who've tied themselves to an elephant as part of their statement of faith. So it's very tricky when you look at the Bible and you start to try and say, well, this was okay then and not okay then. There were homosexuals welcome in the early church, not because of their homosexuality, but because oftentimes they didn't have a choice. The slave couldn't say no to their master. And that's the world the early church was born in. And you could see Paul, especially writing in Philemon, you could see Paul trying to address these issues. And yet there were no boycotts of certain products because they were gay friendly. Paul actually tells his followers, you can go ahead and eat that meat that was offered to demons. Now, I don't know if Ben and Jerry's offers their ice cream to demons, but Paul's view on Ben and Jerry's ice cream is, yeah, go ahead and eat it, unless somebody makes a big deal about, its supernatural connections, which was Paul's advice to people about meat that was offered to idols, pretty much in the Old Testament by idol worshiping priests. Paul said, if it's a good steak, eat it. Don't complain unless they make a big deal about the God it was offered to. Then say, you know what? I'd rather fast than participate in something like this. So there was a lot more flexibility in the early church than there is today. And especially in the American church, a lot more stuffy, a lot more narrow-minded and closed off and not welcoming. And I think that's a huge disservice to the gospel. I think we've placed unnecessary obstacles in front of the gospel, and we don't appear to be loving. We appear to be judgmental and hypocritical in many circumstances. And so often I'm asked about this question, and it does make me cringe, because it's always an us and them kind of issue, and it's always a generic kind of issue, and it's never, if your daughter was a lesbian or if your neighbor was, how would you treat them? Let me tell you, I think we should treat all people the same. And that is the worst person you've ever met. This is the best thing you could say about the worst person you've ever met. And please don't connect this to I'm saying lesbians or gays are the worst people you've ever met. I'm not. But I know that some people who might be listening might group them in a category like that. So let me say this. Here's the best thing you could say about the worst person you've ever met. First of all, they're loved by God. They're actually God desired. God desires to have a relationship with them. They're loved by God. They're loved by God to such a degree that he would send his son to stand in between them and despair. They're loved by Jesus Christ, who would fall on their neck and kiss them if they walked up onto his front lawn. Now, that's a very different reception than most people would get who are seen as something to be shunned by the church if they came to the church. And again, I refer to a magnificent moment in the life of Robert E. Lee. And you've heard me mention this before if you follow the program for any length of time. But Robert E. Lee, of course, the famous Confederate general whose battles are still studied in war colleges around the world, most famous for his battle at Chancellorsville when Stonewall Jackson met his untimely death. But Lee divided his troops in front of a numerically superior army, which is never done. It's foolhardy. But he rolled up, I think it was their left flank, with Jackson leading the coup, and he routed the Union Army. And unfortunately, General Jackson was shot by friendly fire, but it's still considered a landmark victory against all odds. And many people think that Lee was very brave because of his pursuits on the battlefield. And I don't want to steal that from you, but I think his bravest moment came in a church after the war, his local church, which you could still visit. As far as I know, they still have his pew. I think it's pew 17 marked where he used to sit, and it's a couple pews in back of or in front of where General George Washington used to sit. They attended the same church at different eras. But at one point on a Sunday service just after the war, a young black man entered that white church. And it was just at the time that they were about to receive the Eucharist. So they were about to take communion. And this black man, I don't know, maybe he was trying to make a statement. I guess he was trying to make a statement, kind of like Rosa Parks, but at a very volatile time. He walked down the aisle and he knelt in front of the parson ready to receive communion. Now, a lot of people don't think church is a good place to make a political statement. And maybe he wasn't making a political statement. If you think about it, that's a very spiritual statement, right? That's something that Paul actually argued in Galatians and elsewhere, that in the body of Christ, there really is no black or white. There's no slave or free. There's no male or female even. There's no Jew and barbarian. We are one body in the body of Christ. So maybe he's making that kind of a profound statement. But needless to say, there were people who were disgruntled in the crowd, even in church, and they were waiting for somebody to act, somebody to stand up and grab this guy by the scruff of his neck and kick him out into the street. I mean, they have their own church down the street. Doesn't he know that? And finally, the chancellor of a university, generally, retired generally, stood up and walked to the front, and people took a breath for the first time. They thought, okay, now this guy's going to get his due. This is our hero. And everyone in the room respected Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee stood next to the young man and knelt down next to him. And then he looked up at the parson and nodded his head. Get on with it. He took communion with his brother in Christ. Now, that might have rubbed the cat the wrong way in that church, even though people worshiped Robert E. Lee. He might have done something there to offend not only friends, but family. I don't know. I'm certainly, he offended some people in that room, and yet maybe some people were taught to get beyond their bigotry because of that one generous moment that said, there are things in this world that transcend our superficial differences and the unnecessary obstacles that we build around each other, around each other's tribes, that we try and fortify our little places with statements of faith or rules or things that just weren't present in Lydia's living room, because it was a privilege to worship Christ under those circumstances. Look, behind the Iron Curtain, where to worship Christ meant you might lose your life or your freedom, I highly doubt that they were as particular or finicky as the American church is with who can come and who can't. And maybe we can take a lesson from that. Maybe we can realize that coming together to learn about, to celebrate, to praise, and to worship the Son of God and God's grace is the exact place where we want our neighbor who's either struggling with sexuality or is not struggling with sexuality, but has a different one than ours. Personally, my table is open to all people because I believe that's what God asks of me. That doesn't mean I condone everything. I certainly, if I was in Lydia's living room, wouldn't condone the slave master next to me. But I know that he has a much greater opportunity or capacity for growth, for spiritual growth, to grow out of his current relationship by hearing the words of the apostle read. Then if we told him, you're not welcome. That's really all I wanted to say to you today. I will say this, the Sparrows Call has been getting a great response, a lot from mothers who have children who have left the faith, and they feel like they have no hope, and they've found hope at the Sparrows Call. So if you know somebody who's troubled in the faith or who considers themselves a dun or a nun, or no longer a Christian who's gone through deconstruction, like Rhett and Link or Aaron Rodgers, they don't have to leave the faith. Um, Oftentimes they're leaving the church, and oftentimes that's a wise decision for what we've just talked about and more. So don't see them as, somebody who's without hope, and center your conversations with them not around the church or getting back to church, but around Jesus Christ, around the essentials, the fundamentals. And that's why the Sparrows Call, when people ask, what are you? I don't say non-denominational anymore. Corrie Ten Boom cured me of that, because in her cell block in Nazi concentration camp, all were welcome. And so they were trans-dispensational or pan-dispensational. They were pan-denominational, I should say. So they welcomed Lutherans and Catholics, and I believe people coming to the Lord's table. The hand can't say the I have no need of thee. Welcome to diversity, and let's have harmony with that diversity, and many different voices one day will raise up in praise of Jesus Christ in all different languages. And I think that's a blessing. But many mothers have contacted me, and they are grateful that I'm pointing them out to resources to help with their understanding of their husband who's left the faith, or their children who are leaving the faith. There is hope, and there are reasons, that there are actually good reasons to appreciate what your children are going through. And the more you understand it, the better you are to be able to minister to them. And so we welcome all at the Sparrows Call. But one of the videos we've got coming out is called "How to Come Out to Your Evangelical Parents." And I know that sounds provocative. It's not just going to be about sexual identity. It's going to be about those clearing unnecessary obstacles to the gospel and to a relationship with God that the church has placed there, but God hasn't. And so it might sound provocative, but I ask you to join me in that episode. It'll be coming out soon. And thank you for listening today. May God be a pleasant hope in your time of trouble. We'll see you next week.